Hello, everyone. It's wonderful, so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to give this presentation. It's truly an honor for me. All right. So this paper concerns the stylistic approaches exhibited by orchestral conductors in late 19th century Europe. Specifically, observers in this period identified two principal approaches to conducting the classic works of Beethoven. The first, so-called objective or classical approach, required that the contents of the score be performed as precisely as possible, with little to no interpretive involvement from the conductor. The other approach, often referred to as subjective, romantic, or Wagnerian, emphasized the performer's freedom to insert their own personality into the music, thus bringing out the latent expressive qualities of the score. The former aesthetic then stressed supposed transparency in performance, while the latter implied that the composer's intentions could only be revealed by a musician who uncovered the deeper meanings hidden beneath the surface of the notes through a sensitive interpretation of the work. Yet while both contemporary critics and later scholars have outlined the nature of these competing approaches in theory, it is much less clear exactly how this theory manifested in actual performance practice. That is, how a classical or romantic interpretation of the Viennese classical repertoire would have sounded in a late 19th century concert hall. In this paper, I will focus primarily on early recorded examples of the classically styled conducting approach, which I will contrast with the slightly more often discussed romantic approach. My examples will focus specifically on the symphonies of Beethoven, owing to his privileged position within the symphonic repertoire throughout the 19th century. Finally, I will briefly contextualize these approaches within both 19th century performance aesthetics and the history of orchestral conducting. I will begin with George Henschel, a conductor born in 1850, who was best known during his lifetime as a baritone. In his youth, he studied piano with Ignaz Moscheles, who himself had been a pupil of Beethoven. This makes Henschel unique among the conductors who left recordings of Beethoven's symphonies. He is the only one who trained under one of the composer's own students. As a conductor, he produced one recording, which was of Beethoven's Symphony No. 1, which he made in 1927 with the Royal Philharmonic. I will now play an excerpt from the exposition in the first movement containing the transition from the primary and secondary themes. As we can hear, Henschel's tempo is remarkably consistent and relatively slow. His priority seems to be to bring out the work's metrical structure as opposed to shaping its phrases through expressive timing. We can contrast this approach with that of Willem Mengelberg, a conductor recognized for embodying a highly romantic aesthetic. We can hear that Mengelberg engages in significant tempo modifications for expressive purposes, which is distinctly the opposite of Henschel's approach. Oh my God, okay, okay, all right, I'm sorry about that. In fact, Henschel's extant writings reveal disapproval of romantic attitudes towards conducting the Viennese classical repertoire, with particular disdain for the widespread use of tempo modifications. For example, in a 1920 review, Henschel wrote that critiques liberties of one of his colleagues had evidently taken with Beethoven. He claimed, quote, "If 100 years ago an intimate of Beethoven's had dared to do such a thing in Beethoven's presence, the master would have flung the score at his head, thundering, 'Knave, canst thou not read? Dost thou think if I had wanted these two general pauses, I did not know how to put them in my score?'" Henschel goes on to lament what he calls, quote, "irreverence, contempt of traditions, breaking with a glorious past, disregard of law of form." Revealingly, he compares such liberties to an actor, quote, "tired of that everlasting to be or not to be, and thinking it too hackneyed, surprising the audience by commencing the great monologue for a change with 'to exist or not to exist,' end quote." The analogy is certainly instructive in illuminating Henschel's view on romantic performance practices, such as tempo modification. To him, such changes would not earn the composer's approval. Not only were they unnecessary, but also motivated solely by the search for novelty. Indeed, it is notable that Henschel regarded this romantic performance style as modern, while rendering the score with steady tempi was presented as the older and more traditional way to conduct the Viennese classical works. So we know that Henschel regarded himself as a classicist, but how did critics perceive Henschel's style? Although critics often objected to his sometimes unorthodox tempo choices, their accounts of his conducting style seem to conform with a distinctly classical approach. At the time of its release, this recording in particular was well received by the Phonograph Monthly. The reviewer commended the recording for having been, quote, "remarkably faithful and characteristic example of the old German classic school, and its value as such is naturally high," end quote. Even though this critic was ambivalent over some of the slower tempi, he clearly considered Henschel's aesthetic to be more traditional and thus in firm agreement with Henschel's artistic aims. One second. I seem to have lost the PowerPoint on here. I'm very sorry about that. I'm very sorry. I don't know what happened.
Is it here?
No, it's on a slide.
Online, you played online.
It is. No, it's. I don't know where
Which one's yours? Is it that one?
Yeah, this one.
There you go.
Okay, right, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. I will next discuss Karl Muck, a Swiss conductor born in 1859 and was perhaps most famous for his interpretations of Wagner, notably Parsifal. His interpretations not only of Wagner, but also of the Viennese classics, were highly regarded during his lifetime. Although the great majority of Muck's recordings are of Wagner, he did record the first half of the finale of Beethoven's Symphony No. 7, with the Boston's Symphony Orchestra in 1917. I will play the beginning of the movement, focusing on his treatment of the primary and transition themes. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Well, I'll just go to the next slide.
Max problem.
Okay, just thank you. Sorry, apologies. All right. All right, just like in many of his recordings, Muck keeps remarkably steady tempi, eschewing any outward sentimentality and tempo fluctuations unmarked in the score. The performance is highly polished and displays a great deal of commitment to rhythmic precision. I'm not going to play it, but in contrast, we can hear in Strauss's rendition, he makes several tempo modifications which likely bear the influence of his mentor, Hans von Bülow. By contrast, Muck as a conductor appears to have advocated against the romantic interpretation applied to Viennese classical works, or to any work for that matter, unless expressly sanctioned by the composer. In an interview he gave to the New York Times in 1906, Muck had the following to say about the conductor's role in music making. Quote, "In giving compositions, he should not sound the personal note. His own personality has nothing whatever to do with it. To attempt to give an individual interpretation of the work of a composer is often to give exactly what the composer did not mean." In turn, Boston critics from the early 20th century were unanimous in characterizing Muck as a classicist, one that favored minimal rubato and advocated fidelity to the written score. An anonymous journalist, writing in a 1906 review, introduced Muck as, quote, "a thinker and analyst," and his interpretations were described as, quote, "those of an earnest seeker after the composer's meaning, without putting into his performances the personal influences that modern conductors often bring to this task," end quote. The reviewer went on to describe Muck's reading of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 thus: "He put many finely wrought nuances in the symphony by Beethoven, but he sought for no new and startling features. It was not a Wagnerized version," end quote. Despite Muck's close associations with Wagner's music, his conducting of Beethoven was not viewed as embodying Wagner's conducting aesthetics. Note, for instance, a review of his performance of Beethoven's Seventh, which a critic described as, quote, "sane, strong, and dignified, instinct with life, with the meaning and significance of each phrase, and seeking at no point to find any new sensation." As we can see, these accounts are fully supported by the recording's strict tempo, its lack of rhetorical flourishes, and the polished and highly spirited orchestral playing throughout the movement. In addition, they reveal that critics viewed his approach to Beethoven as more traditional than Wagnerian approaches, which they revealingly considered a trait of modern conductors. From recorded examples such as these, we can conclude that critical accounts which compare classical versus romantic conducting aesthetics do not merely reveal subjective perceptions of individual reviewers. The stylistic differences they describe were real. They are preserved on early sound recordings and can be directly measured and quantified. These differences are also specific, with the main issue being the presence and amount of tempo fluctuations. At the same time, a classical or a romantic stylistic label only conveys roughly whether and how much rubato was used. It does not tell us about other equally important aspects of an orchestral performance, such as tempo choices, dynamics, ensemble precision, timbral balance, rhythmic articulations, and the overall quality of technical execution. Finally, although the classical conducting style revealed in Henschel and Much's recordings and others bears some resemblance to the principles of modernist conducting that arose in the 20th century, at the time these conductors performed and recorded, their approach was not perceived by them or their critics as modern or as a rejection of past traditions. Rather, their conducting, I believe, is better understood as a continuation of an older performance aesthetic, its roots going back to Felix Mendelssohn and Karl Czerny. Thus, while it is true that orchestral performances featured increasingly less rubato as the 20th century progressed, this does not imply that a Beethoven symphony played without deliberate rubato necessarily exemplifies a modernist performance aesthetic. Plenty of conductors trained in the 19th century by their older colleagues employed little to no rubato when performing Viennese classical works, while many critics perceived a romantic interpretation of such pieces as a newer approach. For instance, the conductor Felix Weingartner, the first to record all 9 of Beethoven's symphonies, was praised in a 1903 review as appealing to those, quote, who think that Beethoven's music should be performed so far as is possible in the spirit of the composer and not used merely as a vehicle for displaying the idiosyncrasies of a modern conductor. With this in mind, the critic concludes that Weingartner is, quote, emphatically a classical conductor, end quote, and one who, quote, strives to merge his own personality in that of the composer, viewing the music so far as he is able from the composer's standpoint. The critic goes on to contrast this aesthetic with, quote, the romantic school of conducting, in which the conductor aims, above all things, to give novelty and individuality to his reading by any sensational piece of charlatanism that occurs to him, end quotes. As well as most of us are well aware, this debate over how to best interpret the Viennese classical repertoire goes back to the earliest days of baton conducting. Mendelssohn, for instance, advocated what was known as a texttreu approach, meaning true to the text. Unlike Wagner and his followers, Mendelssohn was known for maintaining steady tempi and believed that the conductor ought to be a transparent entity merely to serve the composer's vision. These aesthetic debates even divided Beethoven's own close associates, most notably Karl Czerny and Anton Schindler. Czerny, along with Ferdinand Ries and Ignaz Moscheles, advocated swift and steady tempi of Beethoven's music. Schindler stood in opposition to this approach and advocated a proto-romantic style that would be taken up by the conducting of Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. While Czerny's piano playing by all accounts included unmarked rubato and ornamentation, likely in a similar vein to the classically minded soloists Joseph Joachim and Adelina Patti, conductors evidently did not adopt these stylistic features until much later. The reason for this may be the fact that baton conducting was a more recent art than solo and chamber performance. Its practical realities were also much different. Until later in the 19th century, most orchestral works were performed after 1 or at most 2 rehearsals. Finally, throughout much of the 19th century, orchestral conducting was little more than a practical necessity to maintain tempi and keep an ensemble together. Weingartner, for instance, in his memoir, had described a conductor named Herr Kreibel, whom Weingartner described as, quote, a type of conductor that has now practically died out, the kind that beats exact time. Not a crotchet was out of place, and each one was exactly like the next. In this paper, I have aimed to clearly distinguish the classical conducting style from the more often discussed Romantic aesthetics. As such, I have sought to recontextualize early recorded conducting styles, exhibiting little to no tempo modifications, which are often labeled as modernist, as representing an older classical tradition. And some of my references here, and I guess I finished with a few extra minutes. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.